Good morning, everybody. If you would like to open up your Bibles to James chapter 1, we're going to read a couple of passages from James this morning. And I know that everybody who is a part of my church family and who listens to me on a regular basis will probably roll their eyes at me when I say this, but I don't intend to have a very long lesson this morning. Just a couple of quick thoughts about life in general right now, life in general for the rest of time, and some things that we can be thinking about. In James chapter 1, starting in verse 2, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And now I would ask you to turn over to James chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 7 through 11. James chapter 5, beginning in verse 7. "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job. You have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." Whenever I've talked about this subject in the past, what I have always tended to do is to literally beg people to pay attention to what we're talking about right now. This is going to be something that I can 99.9% promise you're going to have to deal with at some point in your life. I especially need to give this strong encouragement to young people. In fact, this lesson that I'm doing right now is a lesson that I did at camp in 2014. And when I talk to young people, some of whom, I would even go ahead and guess, a lot of whom have not experienced a lot of trouble or hardships in their life up to this point, I say to them when we begin this subject, I'm really sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I'm begging you to pay attention, because I promise that suffering and hard times in your life is something that you are going to have to deal with. It's just a reality of being a human on earth. Unfortunately, suffering and bad times is not a hypothetical conversation. And my opinion is that this subject of suffering and Christians' response to suffering and bad times is, if not the most important thing we need to be talking about on a regular basis, it's absolutely at the very top of that list as one of the most important things that we need to talk about on a rotating and regular basis. Here's the thing. Some of you are going to struggle with having a bad temper. Those of you who have a bad temper are sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, yes, that is a spiritual battle that I experience on a regular basis. Some of us don't have that temptation. It's just not something that some people deal with. Some of you are going to struggle with bad language. It's been a part of your life for a long time. It's a part of your heart, and it's a part of your mind, and it's a part of your regular vocabulary. Other people will never fight that battle. It's just not something that's going to be hard for you. Some of you are going to struggle with sexual temptation. And some of you are going to struggle a lot with sexual temptation. And some people will make it through this life without any kinds of major troubles. But here's the thing about what we're doing today. I can almost promise you that every single one of us will fight this battle. We're all going to face suffering and difficult times and some of the spiritual battles that come with those difficult times. The truth of life is that bad things are going to happen. People are going to let you down. If you're a young person, I promise you your parents are going to let you down. If you're a parent, I promise you your kids are going to let you down. I'm a preacher in a congregation here in Ellisville. I tell this to my congregation on a regular basis. I promise you that I will let you down. I know myself, and I know that I make mistakes. The elders in the congregation where you worship, they're going to let you down sometimes. Your friends are going to let you down and disappoint you. Some of us in life are going to get really sick. And I'm not talking about runny nose sick. I'm talking about really sick. And I think that that's probably at the front of a lot of our minds right now, is the reality of sickness unto death. Weird things are going to happen to you in this life. Your house is going to catch on fire and burn. A tornado or a flood is going to tear through town and take all of your physical possessions. There's a business at the bottom of the hill where I live, right downtown in the commercial district of Eureka. There's a business called Odell's. It's a restaurant. And in 2015, here in Eureka, we had our first 500-year flood. The waters got crazy high, came into their business, shut them down for a while. They had a lot of expenses with renovation. And so the flood subsided and everybody got back to normal. I think it was something like 16 or 18 months later, we had another one of those. And now this, and they're shut down. Can you imagine when we talk about weird things and suffering and hard times? Can you imagine how the Odells must feel right now? They throw their hands up and they say, why would I even try? What's the point in even trying in this life? Weird things are going to happen. Something may go wrong with your kids. I don't even like to think about this one or talk about this one. A few years ago, I did a funeral for a baby who was born, lived 11 weeks, passed away in the hospital, and never even came home. The parents and the grandparents are still struggling with that. Your parents are going to die someday. If the Lord doesn't come back first, or if you don't die first, then I promise you, your parents are going to die. And what happens is our parents get older and they face some of the struggles of life and they pass away, and we throw up our hands as if we never even thought of the possibility. And we say, why did this have to happen to me? God, why did you do this to me? It happens to everybody. All humanity is going to die if the Lord doesn't come back first. Please, would you listen to me on this? If you've not experienced suffering in a big way in your life up to this point, I promise you will. You know that it's coming. And for some people, right now in our world, I expect that it's already here. If you've lost your job or you've been laid off for a long time, or maybe somebody that you know is sick. And almost always, this is the reason why I say that this is a critical subject. This is the thing more than anything else when I talk to people. This is the subject and this is the thing that causes people to question their faith and to wrestle with who God is and why he does the things that he does. God, why are you allowing this? Why are you doing this? Why would God do such awful things to me and to the people that I love? It seems to me like it would be a much better plan to try and think through some of those issues and tackle some of those big subjects that you know we're going to face in our life on the front side before we get to them, rather than waiting until we're in the middle of the fire to finally start thinking about some of these things. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want to just talk about two things to think about in the face of suffering and hard times. Number one, let me just go ahead and say this. I say number one. This is not the first of my two things. Before I start talking about these two things, let me say this. I don't think I have an answer for suffering. I know there's lots of people who have written books and preached sermons, and they've got all kinds of reasons for why bad things happen. I don't know those answers. I don't know if it's because I did something wrong or because somebody else did something wrong. I don't know that, and I don't pretend to know that. But what I do know is two things. Number one, when suffering happens, every single one of us will have one of two responses. It'll either make us better or it'll make us bitter. In James chapter 1, beginning in verse 2, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kind, for you know," this is the word that I want us to pay attention to, "you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." That word testing here in James is found 4 times throughout the Bible. This is one of them. Go over to 1 Peter chapter 1. Another one is in 1 Peter chapter 1, and it's the same kind of context. Beginning in verse 6, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith," there's a word, the tested genuineness of your faith, "more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Turn over to Psalm 12. This is a third time that the word is used in our Bibles, and it's the same kind of context. In Psalm 12, and I'm going to read from verse 6. Psalm 12 and verse 6. "The words of the Lord are pure words, like silver refined in the furnace, on the ground purified 7 times. You'll notice that at least in Peter's use of this word, when he talked about the tested genuineness of your faith, he talked about silver. Here in Psalm 12 and verse 6, he's talking about pure words like silver refined, there's our word, silver tested, silver refined in a furnace on the ground, purified 7 times. And then Proverbs 27 is the last time that this word is used in the Bible. Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 21. "The crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, and a man is tested by his praise." The word tested in all 4 of these different places in the Bible is used to refer to this refinement or purifying process. That's what the word tested actually is. And so here's what we're talking about. Let's say you're walking through the wilderness in the mountains, and you look down and you find a chunk of gold sitting on the ground, and you pick it up. The gold that you find in a natural state is not going to be like the gold in your ring or your earrings right now. It's natural gold, and it's mixed up with all kinds of impurities and other minerals. It's not pure gold. And so the way that you get that gold or any other metal, like silver in a couple of these different passages, the way that you purify that gold and get it to be like the gold that's in your wedding ring that you're wearing right now is you heat it up in a fire and turn the gold into a liquid. And what happens is that gold, that liquid metal, is heavier than all of the other impurities, and it sinks to the bottom and the impurities rise to the top. And so what you'll do with those impurities, called dross, is you'll either scrape them off the top or pour them out. And whenever you cool off the liquid gold and it comes back into a solid state, it's purer now than it was before you took out the impurities. If you will remember, whenever we read Psalm chapter 12, and verse 6, the psalmist referred to purifying and testing and refining 7 times. And so you can imagine, let's say I have natural gold. I heat it up, the gold goes to the bottom, the dross comes to the top, I scrape it off, I let that gold solidify, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat it up again. And the gold is going to go to the bottom, and some of the remaining impurities are going to come to the top. I'm going to scrape them off and I'm going to let it solidify. I'm going to do that 7 times so that at the end of that process, that gold is going to be more pure than it was initially before we started. In James chapter 1 and verse 2, this is what the Bible writers are describing with us and our trials and our difficult circumstances in life. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kind, for you know that the testing or the refining of your faith produces steadfastness. I don't know why suffering happens. But what I do know is that when it happens, most people are going to respond in one of 2 ways. The fire of trial is either going to burn them and consume them and completely destroy them and cause their faith to be rocked so that they will say things like, why has God let this happen to me? And to turn away from God in the accusation that he's some sort of an evil being who doesn't care. Or it's going to burn away the impurities in my soul and I'm going to be stronger and purer on the other side of that trial. The response that every single one of us faces in the midst of hard times and suffering is that trial is either going to make us better or it's ultimately going to make us bitter. Second thing, and then I'll be finished this morning. This is one of the things that causes me to find comfort in the midst of a trial. That is the knowledge that God is suffering alongside me. God, first of all, came into this world in human form, Jesus, and suffered. He knows what it means to hurt. He knows what it means to be lonely. He knows what it means to be betrayed. And I would even say this is the one, if you take this lesson and you only walk away with one thing, let it be this. Roll this one around your mind for a little while. This is the kind of stuff that I like to think about when I'm laying down at night. Just try and process this. In Matthew chapter 27, when Jesus was hanging on the cross, he quoted Psalm 22. And he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay, now think about this. God himself knows what it feels like to feel forsaken by God. Just roll that around your mind for a second. God knows what it feels like. He sympathizes to know what it feels like in the midst of a trial to feel forsaken and abandoned by God. God himself understands what that feels like. I'm going to turn over to Exodus chapter 2. There's a couple passages here in Exodus that I really enjoy when we think about God being with us and understanding what it's like whenever we're suffering. I can't tell you why bad things happen, but I can promise you, because we see it several times throughout the scripture, that when you're in the midst of your trial, God is right there with you, next to you, even if you don't feel like he is. And not only is he present, but he feels and sympathizes and empathizes and stands in your presence. In Exodus chapter 2, in verses 23 through 25, this is when the Israelites were living under the crushing oppression of the Egyptians as slaves. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery. And they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. He's not absent in the midst of our suffering. He is there, and he's listening. And listen to the way that this goes in verse 24 and 25. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel. This is worth highlighting. And God knew. I think it's worth memorizing those words and saying them over and over and over again every single day for the foreseeable future, that God knows. That idea of God knows is that God understands and that God is present. When bad things happen, you can try and figure out a reason for it all. Good luck. People have been working on that since actually the biblical times. You see this conversation and these questions in almost every single book of the Bible, people trying to understand why bad things are happening. But here's the thing, don't blame God. It's not God's fault that we live in a world full of sin and the consequences of sin. And when you think that God has forsaken you, when you start to question, where are you, God, and why are you not listening to me? I want you to remember Psalm 22. I'm going to read one verse in Psalm 22. A minute ago, I referred to verse 1 of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's the start of suffering. To cry out to God for help and to wonder where He is and why He's not present. That's not the way that Psalm 22 ends. In Psalm 22 and verse 24, for He has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and He has not hidden His face from him, but He has heard when he cried to Him. Take comfort and refuge in His promise, and take comfort in the reality that God knows and that God hears. And if it is so possible in your life, let that be enough. Determine to be better on the other side of this mess and whatever trial life throws at you, and not to become bitter because of it. I would ask that you let this sermon not be the end of this conversation. Not only ask, I beg you to think about these things and to work through these things now before we find ourselves in the midst of the storm, because we're going to have a better ability to be rational and to be open-minded to think through them now on the front side than if we wait until we're in the midst of the storm to start asking some of these questions. Mark's going to lead us in a couple songs. The first song is just what you would call an invitation. And then we're going to have a song to prepare our minds for the Lord's Supper. And then Chad is going to lead us in some thoughts to get our minds ready for the Lord's Supper. Thank you for being with us this morning. And if there's anything that I can do to help you or to answer your questions or to help study the Bible and to know God and understand circumstances a little better, I hope that you'll reach out to me. You can find me at simplychristians.com and go to the contact section there.